Everyone, welcome back. I know it's been a little while, so thanks for sticking with us. So tonight's going to be a really interesting conversation. A lot of questions that have come up in previous talks are, how do I make that transition to break into a data role? What kinds of roles should I be applying to? How do I differentiate myself? What should my portfolio look like? So tonight we have Philip Hall. So he is on his way out from Google, but is a senior customer engineer. Previously, you were a consultant, I think, right at Accenture, doing data implementation of some kind. So you've got like the technical brain, and then you have the customer brain. And the reason I bring that up is because I think it's super valuable, and I would argue that one of the trending areas within the data space is to have folks who understand, who have that technical ability, but then can work in sales or finance or in a customer facing role. So that said, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Aaron Falus, founder of Promotable, your host for this session and some of the other ones. And so what do we do? What's breaking into data? So really, this is just a community where we talk to experts, people who do this stuff every single day, to share some of those insights to help you land your next role or learn that thing that's going to help you level up. And so with that, let me hand it off. Philip, you want to give do you want Philip or Phil? What's better?
Doesn't matter to me. Most people call me Phil,
Phil.
but I'll respond to pretty much anything. Beer guy, like data guy.
So beer guy, data guy. Tell us more.
Yeah. So hey everybody. Great to virtually meet all of you. Yeah. So a couple little last minute surprises that I wasn't necessarily expecting when I said that I would do this presentation is I did just have my last day at Google yesterday. So I'm kind of rebranding this to not how to get a job at Google, but how it could be Google or whatever you want your job to be. Because I think ultimately that's more important than just being blinded by a potential sexy logo. That being said, Google, fantastic company. And then, I don't know if it's obvious, but I just got my wisdom teeth taken out today. So if I ever start like slurring or anything, that might be the reason why. But luckily, I think it's going to keep everything loose. So I see this as a good opportunity to make sure I can avoid pain here later. Also a surprise, did not realize that was going to be happening. But yeah, so I'm going to ask some questions. So I know Aaron, I just saw put a little thing in the chat. I do like to keep things interactive, so I'm probably just going to be asking for some like yeses or some nos or some thumbs up as I go through some of the slides. But hopefully we'll get through a lot of that pretty quickly, and then we can just have an open dialogue. So with that being said, let me share my screen. I am unable to share my screen. Oh, great. We should have done a dry run on this, I think.
Potentially.
Yeah. Where you mind if I just share it with you?
And sure. Yeah, share it with me, and then
we can drive.
I can do it. Yeah, that's fine.
All right, cool. Is it just your email address from before, right?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I just dropped onto the same thread that we have.
All right. Sorry about that.
Well, you want to just kind of start with your intro, and then once I get your
yeah, well, the intro is going to be covered a lot as part of the presentation, given the
fair enough. Well, give me 2 seconds, and then I will have that for you.
So what we can do, I guess, in the meantime is I'm just going to ask everybody a quick question.
Here we go.
And we're good. We're in. So
Can you see my screen? Excellent. Yes, you can. And let's go.
Sweet. So yeah, so how I used fantasy football to get a job, and that ultimately led me to Google. So if we go to the next slide, quick question for the rest of the people on this call. Have any of you, or how many of you actually remember this game?
The game of life.
The game of life.
Couple of thumbs up.
couple of thumbs up. Where are we seeing this? I'm not getting any of this.
Oh, you know why? Because it's on LinkedIn itself. So you have to go into the, it doesn't get pulled onto the streaming service because this is anyway.
Gotcha. Anyway, so
I
yeah,
will translate. But anyone who's on the call, please either throw something in the chat. Awesome. Thanks, Derek. Thanks, Michael. Appreciate it. Go for it.
Awesome. So if we move over here to the next slide, this is like kind of what apparently life is according to the board game of life. You either go to college or you don't. You don't have to go to college. Then all of a sudden you get a job, you earn a salary, you get married, maybe you have kids, and then you buy a house, and then you either end up in millionaire states or countryside acres. And that's pretty much the entire trajectory. But then if we go to the next slide, all of those decisions are essentially like random for us. The only true decision that we make is the fact that we are going to go to college or not go to college, which has then a random chance on if we want to end up being a police officer versus a teacher versus an entertainer. And then when you come to like buying the house, you just kind of hope you end up with the split level because it's going to cost you like less money. And then you have like more chance of retiring rich. But ultimately, it sounds like life is just this chaotic world where a lot of these things are predestined. And then the way that you're successful just happens to be based on the spin of a dial or a random drawing of a card. And then you just kind of try to make the best of whatever the game kind of plays out for you. And really, when we think about life more broadly, there's a lot more to life than that, which is really just like, who are you? Like all those pink and blue little things that are riding in your car when you're playing this board game, we don't learn anything about who they are, what they want from life, what they like to do. Like, are they funny? Are they really passionate? Do they like to help others? What do they do on weekends? Like, do they play sports? Do they get involved with charities? Like, what are some of their hobbies that they just like to occupy your time with? And you might now be thinking to yourself, like, I don't care. Like, why does it matter if they're like a pink or green person and what's going on in their heads? Why does any of that actually matter? And before I directly answer that question, I'm going to kind of pivot back to what my trajectory looked like, stealing kind of that framework of how you went through the game of life. So I started off at Indiana University, go Hoosiers. I got an internship at Procter & Gamble. That led to my first full-time employment being with Accenture. I made the decision to leave Accenture after about 4 years to join a data and analytics startup called Looker, which inevitably got acquired by Google. And then now I'm officially in full employment. And so if you look at this progression, it's not that dissimilar to the progression we saw from life. It's like, all right, here's a guy, he went to college, he got an internship, he got a job, he got another job, and then he got like another job that had a cool logo attached to it. And now he's in between things. But that doesn't describe, again, who I am as a person, what motivates me, what's passionate or what I'm passionate about, what I like to do. So now I'll tell you a little bit more about like actually who I am. And so when it comes to me, this is actually just my most recent vacation. It's in Costa Maya, saw some Mayan ruins in Mexico, which is pretty cool. But I am ridiculously outgoing. I enjoy teaching. I like coaching and mentoring. But then most of all, I've always kind of like lived my life by a mantra of like new places, new people, new experiences. Like I just like to be consistently stimulated and always try new things, go in new places and just meet a bunch of strangers. That's where I actually like derive a majority of my energy from. And then when it comes to like what I do on weekends and what are my hobbies, I watch sports. I like to gamble. I brew beer and also go to a lot of breweries. And then I like obsessively create themed Spotify playlists. So again, you're probably thinking to yourself, like, why does any of that matter? And why does that matter specifically for like whether or not I'm actually qualified to do a job or not? And for people who are thinking those things, you are absolutely correct. None of those things should have any bearing on whether or not you hire me or if I'm qualified or if I have the necessary experience to work at Google or any other job. But it does really help, I think, in two things associated with getting a job or keeping a job, which is you just need to be able to find a job, first off. And then you need to be able to advance in your job. And so if we think about what it takes to actually get a job in the first place, and this is a simplification and a little bit of generalizing, which is on the next slide, you probably are going to network. Great. I don't think anybody's just got a job from just going to a networking event for the sake of going to a networking event because that's what you're supposed to do. You can go to career fairs, at least if you're coming out of university, which is probably a really great way to at least get your resume out there and get shortlisted to potentially get an interview and then get a job. You can randomly apply to a bunch of stuff. But ultimately, it's going to come down to is you need to have better experience than your peers or better skills than your peers. And you actually need to be able to convey that in an interview, which is going to come back to our STAR thing. And then, or you can just sit around and let LinkedIn recruiters reach out to you. That's also a viable strategy. But when it comes to probably the most important things on this slide, which is having more experience than your peers and being able to convey that experience better than your peers, this is where having hobbies and being able to passionately talk about the hobbies, we're not ready yet, are really going to be able to help, because you're most likely going to be very passionate about your hobbies. And if you can translate those hobbies into things that give you real world experience, and then you can convey that passion in an interview, you can choose the experiences that you're most excited to talk about, that you have those best experiences, that's ultimately going to help you convey why you're qualified to do a job. So they shouldn't hire you because you play fantasy football. But as we're going to get into it, there's a lot of peripheral things around fantasy football that helped me get a job at these places because I was able to use my passions, my excitement, and my things that I just like to do in my free time and translate that into parallels of why that would also make me a good employee. So you do that, you get the job. Now, how do you advance in the job? Now, you can either be smarter, which I don't know. I think everybody's probably already kind of reached their capacity if they're on this call of how smart they're ever going to be. And then how do you even define smart? That's not really a great way to advance in your job. You can work harder, certainly. And you can work more hours. But the problem with those two things is that's not really sustainable. If you work too hard for too long, you're going to get burnt out. And then ultimately your job performance is going to suffer. And if you're just working more hours all the time, you're probably going to be sacrificing other things in your life that actually make you happy, which is then going to make you less happy, which is then going to make you less effective. And you get this whole cycle. And then there's also, again, sort of more of the joke strategy. If you can just be really patient and wait for people above you to quit. But that is just that you have no control over any of those things. And then you're kind of losing track of what your career path should be. So why having and being able to speak to your passions is beneficial for this is if you can find something that you really enjoy doing, you can find roles for yourself that you're going to be more effective at. So you don't have to work harder or more hours. You're just going to be more of a natural fit. And then also it can potentially allow you to work more hours by getting involved in what would be considered plus ones or extracurriculars at work that to you don't even feel like plus ones because you just really enjoy doing that stuff. So you can actually take what you do for fun. And if you can find that a way to make that more effective at your job, that's also going to be able to help your career path and help you grow. So here's my life again. And I took those same colors from before, whether that was around getting a job or whether that was around growing my career at that job. And I put them around each of those logos previously. And then I'll talk about some stories about how I was able to convey some of those things and how that was allowed me to get the experience and be able to then convey that experience in order to progress my career. So IU, obviously you're going to college. It's a huge foundation in getting a job. But at the same time, I think there were 32,000 people that went to IU. Even if you wanted to narrow it down to similarly majored or ambitious people, I went to Kelley School of Business. I think there were 6,000 people, even in Kelley. So again, that's a lot of people that you're going to need to compete with and stand out. And that's why if we think back to that game of life, oftentimes it does just feel like a little twist of a spinner or a random thing of, awesome to hear that somebody else used fantasy football to get a job, or a random drawing of a card, because it can seem chaotic. You have all these interviews, you have all these career fairs. It's very stressful. And you don't necessarily just seems like, if I talk to 30 companies, maybe I'll get 10 interviews. I'll get 4 final round interviews, and then hopefully that's enough final round interviews to get me an offer. And it just does seem kind of like a random, chaotic experience. But I'll dive a little bit more into how fantasy football and other things were able to help shape that. And then also, once I moved on to Accenture and Looker, how those same passions were able to help me grow my career. So if we go one slide further, it all started initially at IU. And so you think back to the things I like to do. I like to play sports. I guess for the public record, was not drinking at the time. But I liked sports. I liked fantasy football. I knew that I liked being outgoing, and I liked public speaking, and I liked traveling. So I captained an intramural sports team. Like, you don't really have experience as a freshman, so you have to drive whatever those things are there. I was very passionate about that. I took a leadership position in like an outdoor adventure living and learning community where we went like skiing and whitewater rafting and that kind of thing. I joined a business fraternity, which gave you a ton of opportunities to actually harness and polish some of those more business related skills, get involved in community service, other types of experiences. And I also became fantasy football commissioner for my freshman year dorm floor. And the thing about all of that, and the one thing I'll also say is I also signed up for an international business class where I got to then travel to Europe for spring break and like learn about business and gather more experience there as well, because I like to travel. So it's, again, identifying those things, making sure that you don't see your personal life and your professional life as being separate. You always want to try to find that blend and those experiences where if you love something and you find that you can do that, that's always going to convey it best when you actually start interviewing and then need to convey those experiences to differentiate yourself. So that allowed me to get a summer job my freshman year. I'll admit, like, that was also just sometimes a lot of hard work, just because a lot of people want juniors or people that they would expect that they can hire full time. But then because I was able to take those early experiences, parlay that into real work experience, then me getting my sophomore year summer job was really easy. And then I was able to get into a leadership conference. That was with Procter & Gamble, which then got me the internship at Procter & Gamble. And then once I got that internship at Procter & Gamble, now I have 3 summers worth of experience. So now when it comes to how you get a job, we're still on the same slide. That's going to, we'll work on our chemistry as we do more of these. It's cool. But that then allowed me to have a lot of freedom and flexibility to essentially treat finding that job in a low pressure scenario, because I knew I had fallback options. I knew I had that experience. And then I got to then use what I liked and what I enjoyed doing as a way to disqualify other companies and help kind of gather that rapport. So when I would go to these career fairs, I would hand in my resume. I would make a joke. I would ask about fantasy football. And then I would maybe see if they did a March Madness tournament or something along those lines. And then I was actually getting to really know the people, and that probably then got me shortlisted for interviews. And then I subsequently chose my job at Accenture. But again, that all started from not just getting the good grades or joining the club. It was all part of some cohesive narrative where you truly understand what you enjoy doing. And then you put yourself in those scenarios and those extracurriculars where you're going to be able to really bring that passion to light as it comes to those interviews and as you network into the future. So that was how I got the first job. When I actually started at Accenture, this was where fantasy football really, really, really started to become a turning point for me in my career. So one of my first like big marquee clients was Target. One of the first things I did at Target, again, just because something that I'm passionate about, is I like trying new things. Minneapolis is a big enough city, huge African and Asian populations, tons of ability to like try new foods, all kinds of things. But then because I was a little analytical, I was like, well, hey, how do I actually like use my analytics to help me decide where I should eat lunch or dinner tonight? So I created a VBA macro in Excel that took like stuff from Yelp and then randomly told me where I should eat lunch that day. And then I showed my coworkers and my clients, and then it ended up being like a whole thing. So then you go to Twins games, and then you start meeting people. And I was talking with the senior manager. At the time, I was just an analyst. And he and I really hit it off about fantasy football. And very, again, analytical and critical, pretty opinionated about these things. He was like, hey, I'm thinking about starting up a new fantasy football league. It's going to be an auction. We're going to be able to assign contracts. Would you like to be in this fantasy football league? So I'm like, heck yeah, I'll be in your fantasy football league. We're in the fantasy football league. We're going auctions. I'm starting to notice these patterns and trends. So I'm pinging him on Slack, or I guess it was Skype for Business at the time was the thing that everybody was using. And I'm noticing some of these trends where I'm like, hey, like if you like bid in these increments, like sometimes people like don't bid a certain way, or like there's sort of like a game theory way that you could approach to it. And he was like, oh man, like that's super smart. I like the game theory and the statistical approach you're taking to this fantasy football league. And I was like, well, I mean, I think I'm rolling off in a couple months. So like if you know of any clients that enjoy those types of skills, let me know. And then that's how I ended up at Lego. And then so typical client work at Lego, stayed in my normal, just sort of like work routine. But I don't know if you know where Lego is headquartered in North America, but it's in kind of right on the border of Connecticut and Massachusetts. And some of the best breweries in the world are in like a weekend drive, like radius of that particular area. So that's when I got really, really into beer and all these breweries. And so then again, just as like a pet project, scraped a bunch of stuff from like Beer Advocate and Untapped and all these kind of places, built a dashboard in Tableau, just showed it off because that's what I was passionate about. And then the partner that I'm working with is like, hey, I'm going to send this to the people at Miller Coors. We're getting an analytics project staffed up over there. And I'm sure like this dashboard would get you a shoe-in. And then sure enough, got a new role at Miller Coors while being at Accenture. And then my actual job was two of the things I'm most passionate about, beer and analytics. So then when it came to interviewing with Looker, now it wasn't even that like you had to like think about cool opportunities or projects, because I was literally for like the past year doing exactly what I wanted to do and then setting myself up for like the level of success that I would need to be to take on a data and analytics role elsewhere. But the thing that really ended up selling it was every single person who interviewed at Looker at the time had to give a 20-minute presentation on something that was technical that they were passionate about. It didn't have to mean it was about technology, just something that it was technical about, or that got very technical. And I brew my own beer, and I really like beer. So I gave my presentation on how a better understanding of the beer brewing process is going to help you to navigate an increasingly saturated market. And so luckily I had 4 interviewers and was just like, hey, like, here's how you evaluate a beer. Like, what does it look like? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? What does it feel like? Coincidentally, there were 4 interviewers. So then I just said, what do you want it to look like? Wrote it on the whiteboard. What do you want it to smell like? Wrote it on the whiteboard, et cetera. And then I gave a macro overview of the brewing process. And then I did a deep dive into like the micro level of the brewing process, where we even talked about like all the way down to pH and water chemistry and how more salts of a particular variety could accentuate some flavors than others. And again, presentation went well because I was super, super passionate about the subject material. It showed that I can get really passionate and speak well about those types of things. And then ultimately I got the job, and then I ended up at Looker, which got absorbed into Google. There a little over 4 years, and that came with several promotions. So again, the last slide here, if we go down to 16, is kind of how, again, we took what are you passionate about and using that as extracurriculars into your job. So most companies will have different paths of climbing the ladder. You could do like the people manager path, where like your entire job is just to make sure that other people are doing their jobs well. You could do more of like a tech specialist path. You could do more of a just individual contributor type path. And because I knew when I started, I quickly established myself because I built a beer demo. I did a blog post about March Madness. I again commissioned fantasy football leagues. I started predicting sporting events with Looker and Google technologies. That quickly got me a reputation of being able to create fun demos, fun presentations, public speaking. But then also I really love traveling. So now they know that I can public speak and I like to travel. That's not always the same thing like for other people. Some people like to spend more time at home. So now I'm always on the road, speaking at all these public events, meeting all these new people. I'm very, very happy. One of the reasons why I I think, quit or at least struggled to deal with what I should do was because COVID kind of killed all the things I loved about my job. So it required like a lot of that introspection. But ultimately, again, it was fantasy football, it was beer, it was taking those things and then translating them into things that I could do work that ultimately got me promoted. Because when I went up for my purse cycle, I could say that I spoke at 14 conferences or did 6 webinars that exposed our products to thousands of people, and then also mentor people in the process because people would want to follow up and ask questions, and then I could have natural opportunities for mentorship as well. So it doesn't have to always be that stereotypical career path of you do the IC role for 3 years, then maybe you mentor somebody, then you become a manager, and then if you're really good at that, then you become a leader. Theoretically, I was on a track where I could have gotten that all while just following my passions and sticking in that individual contributor role, just because it gave me the opportunity to show my thought leadership and show my ability to drive revenue and all of these other things. So again, I don't believe in life hacks. Just by playing fantasy football, you're not going to get a job at Google. I think the real moral of the story here is that as long as you know it makes you happy and you know how you can be measured as a successful employee, anytime you can find those overlaps, it's going to make you happier. It's going to make you a better employee. And then also, you don't have to worry about working harder, working smarter, working longer hours. You're actually kind of doing that. I traveled more. I did way more 7 p.m. webinars. So like I wasn't just closing my computer every day at 5. But because I was passionate about those things, it didn't feel like work. So you still got the work-life balance and you had that ability to grow your career. So that, I think, is the moral of the story in all of this is find what you're passionate about, find groups who share those passions, use those experiences in those groups to like build your portfolio of something that you could talk about in an interview or something that you could use to create your own brand or presence on something like LinkedIn or Medium or Ghost or however you choose to eventually do that. So that's my spiel.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So got a couple of questions are rolling in, but in the meantime, I have a super important question for you. What is your favorite beer?
That's a really hard.
Both type. Okay, so not maybe not brand, but are you an IPA man? Are you a stout person? Are you you can tell I like beer, but I don't know much about it. Are you a lager person?
So I'll say that my favorite go-to beer, and I used to be really big into IPAs, and I still am. But like because I like really know what I like, I'm very, very critical. And there's a lot of hype, especially with the hazies, and like people are kind of marketing it, but like they don't actually know what they're doing a lot of the times. And so with my older age, if you can see some of the grays in my beard and in my hair, I've really started to gravitate towards like Pilsners and Helles lagers and that type of thing. And there's a brewery right by me over kind of in like Fulton Market area in Chicago called Great Central. And they probably have one of my like favorite Pilsners of all time. And so because it's really close, just easy for me to always have like a 12-pack of that in the fridge or something. So
well, that's fun. I mean, personally, since I'm also in Chicago, and I have a new brewery to go to because I've only done the Lagunitas one, which is fun, which is a nice go-to IPA. But on a more serious note, 2 things. One, for folks who have questions, feel free to throw those in the chat. We'll definitely get to those. On my end, like a lot of the questions that we get, because I love that you talked about like those projects, how you kind of positioned yourself to do them without doing them. One question that I'm kind of anticipating, so I'll just throw it out there and steal someone's thunder. Like, how technical do you have to be? Like, can it be like an Excel project? Like what kind of stuff do you think is like helpful for setting yourself up for we'll call it a data related role, right? It doesn't have to be a data scientist or something, but like whether you're in sales or finance or who cares where, but like what makes it actually valuable beyond just the fact that it's a passion project?
Yeah. So a lot of it's mindset, right? So I think the thing that makes it valuable is not necessarily that it's a technical skill or you are technical. It is that you think a certain way, you saw a problem and you thought of your own way to solve that, like approach that problem and solve that problem. And probably along the way, you learned a new skill that was not dictated by your job role or by your boss. So I would say that's the core reason why that is more impactful than any of the technical skills itself. I started off doing those things in Excel. and then I taught myself Tableau, and then I actually took a little SQL in college, but most of that was also just kind of learned on the job. I would not say I'm a technical person. If I have to even like think about the concept of opening up a command line like shell interface, I like have a minor panic attack. So it's me, that was always my outlet, was I was always wanted to do something. And then I learned the minimal amount of technology I needed to go do it. And then I found out that those also happened to be marketable on the job market, on the job front. So
Well, yeah, that was the other question of like when did you realize like, you know, you're like attempting to learn some sort of SQL stuff and you're like, actually like data's cool. What I really like is uh talking to people and brewing beer or whatever.
yeah.
Like how do you make that like kind of transition? Because like obviously when you go into consulting, you're just like thrown into shit. You have some people who are like, I just want to be behind a computer, and you have some people who just talk but don't know a thing, you know. They're just like, let me bring on my expert here. Um,
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a good question. I'd say that like that Target to Lego transition was really, really started to make sense for me. Prior to that, I was always like, how do I do the traditional analyst to senior analyst to consultant to manager path? And like, you had all of your like little hacks, like, oh, when you're at your promotion year, make sure to like stay all 12 months at a client because then you're more likely to get laddered well. And it was always stuff where ultimately, like, you did not have control over the process ultimately. You just did what you heard, thought might you get where you wanted to go. But once I pivoted and had that fortunate experience to be able to find that client through things that I'm passionate about, that was a very seminal moment for me where I realized that I was able to continuously find things that I wanted to do. And I did not live my career because that's how I thought you were supposed to climb the ladder. I lived my career the way that I wanted to, and then was still able to climb it. I might just also be very lucky and privileged. Who's to say? But I
think we're all a little lucky and privileged. No, I mean, that makes sense. I think one of the other questions that comes up frequently is like, how do you even like initiate those kind of conversations? I think for you, it may come a little easier because you're extremely extroverted. For those of us on the other end of the spectrum, what does that like process look like? Where you're like, hey, I know I can do this. How do I look for that like next thing? Is it like, do you like reach out to someone on LinkedIn like I did to you and say, hey, let's talk? Did you have you always been headhunted? Did you have to go through a traditional recruitment process? What were kind of those processes like for you?
So Accenture was traditional like university recruitment process. Looker was like a little bit of like a headhunted.
Mm-hmm.
Like I got originally got reached out to a recruiter. Got rejected before I even interviewed because they were looking for someone with more sales experience. And then I'm not sure what happened, but then I got reached out to again 3 months later, and then had the opportunity to do that.
Someone got fired. Anyway,
I don't know about that. I think it was more of a Chicago isn't necessarily the best market for finding like tech salespeople. I think at least it wasn't. So I think they were like, maybe we'll just find some consultants who have a personality for it. But the advice I would give though to your other point, I'm very outgoing and like to meet new people. So my outlet is often just talking about what I enjoy doing. And that comes very naturally to me. But I've seen people who are introverted and some people who aren't necessarily even social, still doing tech roles, still doing sales roles within tech. And some of the things that like made them stand out as I was interviewing or growing up the office in Chicago was they had a page, like their own personal page, and they just had some of their thoughts and their articles and and Tableau dashboards that they had created. So even though they might not be like overtly expressing that they're interested in all this cool stuff, as long as that's searchable, somebody's going to find it, and that's a huge differentiator. I recently was talking with someone in Austin who generates all this amazing content on LinkedIn and like videos and things, and then I met him and I was like, oh wow, you're very, very subdued and like not like the most like in your face, which is not what I expected from your content. So I think that's where social media and being able to just create more static content that you can just have available still allows you an avenue to share those passions, even if you're not someone who's going to be as like freely open with their thoughts and ideas as I might be.
Yeah, no, one tip that I actually love from a past speaker. I'm going to give a shout out to Liz. So if she sees this, then she'll give me a hard time. But she actually put her resume on Tableau, and like it was super well done, super well organized, right? There's like all the drop downs, you can hover over, you can see everything. And it kind of killed two birds with one stone, right? It's like you can show off what you can do, and then you also show off that you know a tool without like having to talk about it,
Yeah.
which is kind of like a fun one. We have a question that just came in, and you should be able to see it as well. So while developing the football project, what raw data source did you use? So this person's trying to do something similar, but hasn't found the right source.
Yeah. So that answer has varied as I've gone through my career. To start, I am always a big fan of, and this is weird because like a generally confident person, I think people are overconfident in most everything that they do. And so when it comes to fantasy football, especially, people think there's going to be the next hot guy, or they think this person's going to be a bust, and they think all these things. But most people are usually not good at making those predictions. And even if you look at like something like the economy, like some of the best economists in the world can't accurately predict what GDP growth is actually going to be. So I just took a lot of consensus numbers. So I just literally like would go to like, I don't know, Fantasy Pros or Yahoo or whatever. You can download just some consensus fantasy reports. And then I also looked at average draft position and standard deviations with that. And then that's where my statistical background had a little bit more of an influence, because then I could create a quick little interface and a calculator with some macros that every time a player got drafted, I was not just looking for the best person who was available. I was looking at which player, based on consensus, had the most incremental lift based on where I was drafting them. And then I would use those standard deviations to calculate the probabilities of wide receiver A still being available if I waited around based on where I was drafting. And then I could actually then set like my risk propensity. And then I also shared that with other people, and then they could adjust their rankings and tinkerings and all that kind of stuff. So that one was pretty straightforward, just like download the CSV from just like any fantasy sites. And it was just more in that case, again, it's not necessarily the skills, it's the approach. What is the problem you're trying to solve for? And then what is that approach for how you're trying to solve that problem? And mine was being like, I'm not going to pretend that I know more about fantasy football than anybody, but I can at least have a fluid system so that as that draft is happening, I can try to find diamonds in the rough based on the consensus or players that are overlooked based on where different tiers start and end and all that kind of stuff. Now I hit cool. APIs and I stream it into BigQuery, but that's the story.
Well, it's more convenient when you work for the company that owns BigQuery.
I don't pay $1, even though I'm not at Google. So, but yeah.
I think it's free for the first like million rows, something like that.
It's you get like a terabyte of processing free every month. So unless you're on some real big data sets, which fantasy football data is not that big.
No, yeah. No, but it's cool because you took something that like, you know, if I was talking to someone who was like, I don't know, a director of analytics at some company, they would say the exact same thing, but it would be like, your problem to solve. Here are your metrics, right? So where they were drafted, the consensus average, the standard deviation, right? And it's like, I love that you kind of broke it down in that way. Also, because I'm a nerd, so it's just I'm like not a sports nerd, but I think it's we're all the same breed.
Nerds are good people.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, if you happen to have a little bit of extra beer that you brew, you know, feel free to share below. Anyway, next question from Mylen. What advice would you give to a fresh undergrad in their first year of corporate world and figuring out like next steps? How did you stay patient to find something that actually matched that passion of yours?
Yeah, so I guess I don't know if I necessarily know if I was patient. But I think there's sometimes a misconception when you start a job that you're not like ready to do certain things or take on certain things. But it never hurts to put yourself into situations or ask for the things that you want. So when I actually got hired at Accenture initially, I think I was technically hired into Accenture operations, and my specialty was like data centers. And I still don't to this day even know what that means. But, and this is going to be a little different in consulting versus other corporate jobs, like you're kind of tasked with finding your own clients. Like you have a career counselor and somebody else that like helps you. But I was able to find a job posting, if you will, that basically said, you need to know Excel, you need to know Access, and then understanding of SQL and VBA would be a plus. And so I just reached out to the main role contact and said, like, hey, nice to meet you. I know SQL, I know VBA, and I actually used to be a peer tutor for Access and Excel in college. And then I got that. And then now I was done with operations. I moved over in analytics, and then I started building up that network. And then I was, again, just always very vocal about the things that I enjoyed and the things that I wanted. And I think as long as you're vocal about those things, you'll hopefully have opportunities where somebody's listening. A lot of times people don't listen, but like hopefully somebody's listening, and that's going to be able to help carve you. And then I think just kind of double down on that. Once you identify that you have a strength, whether that's from like observing peers or you just already know, again, be vocal about it. I remember even when I like switched over to Looker, my very first day of my like new hire orientation, I just like saw somebody doing something in SQL, and at that particular time, that was like a huge strength of mine. And I was like, well, why don't you approach it in this way? And he's like, what? And then I was able to quickly show that I at least brought something to the table immediately. And then you start gaining that rapport that much faster. If you have in-house tools, just do stuff in them. Like my first demo I ever built was a beer demo because I still had the beer data. And I just converted to another tool, and then you share that on Slack or with whoever you want. So.
Yeah, no, I love kind of like building those side projects and sharing them, not necessarily because you're like, I'm building this for the job, I'm just building this for fun. And then you have stuff that actually works.
Yeah.
So on that note, I think we're gonna close it out and be respectful of the fact that you did just get your wisdom teeth taken out. So I want to like not take too much more of your evening. Let you get some time to relax. But this is really good. I mean, it's hard to like, I think articulate how all this kind of stuff works. Is for a lot of times it feels like, oh, this person was like perfect, and then they got, then they got promoted, and they got promoted, and then, so like kind of watching that progression of like understanding how do you put yourself in a position to be successful, how do you understand your strengths, how do you kind of match those things. I think is super super important, really cool. So with that, folks who are here live, if you enjoyed this, would love a follow or a like. Always helpful. And then feel free to give some feedback as well. If there's like other topics you guys want to learn about, feel free to drop it in the comments, shoot me an email at aaron@promotable.io. And then with that, thanks everyone for coming, and then we'll see you next time.
And I'm fun employed, so hit me up on LinkedIn. Like always happy to talk or chat or meet. I have literally no commitments right now for the foreseeable probably month or so. So.
Fun employment is the best kind of employment. Yeah. We'll leave it with that, a little bit of wisdom, and